Hi, welcome to CDFS 412. This unit in particular is on adolescent issues on intervention, prevention, and health promotion. So, first, I want to talk a little bit about some of the specific adolescent issues we're going to be talking about today. So, in particular, adolescent issues or outcomes that we are considering include achievement, um, which can include, grades, test scores, things like that. It can also include identity development or intimacy, which can include relationship problems or sexual behaviors. In addition, there are different other developmental problems that adolescents can experience, including things like depression or anxiety. Gender development is also an important consideration. And then we're going to talk more later in the class about positive youth development, things like resilience and thriving. And in this class, we're going to also be referring to the article by Bickle and McDonough. And as they explain in the introduction to their article, practitioners for a long time have been trying to address these issues, particularly in West Virginia and among West Virginian adolescents. So largely framing those attempts is keeping with the larger literature on problem and risky behavior. But as we'll talk about more later in this class, there are a lot of shortcomings with that approach. So in addition, there are risky behaviors that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about intervention and prevention efforts. Risky behaviors are any behaviors that carry the risk for potential harm or any sort of loss. So risk behaviors include things like school failure, so not getting good grades, not getting on to the next grade in school, being retained, can include delinquency, things like minor criminal acts. It's also things like unprotected sex among adolescents because teen childbearing has a lot of negative consequences. In addition, things like substance use, and also, although it might not, it might not be the first thing you think of when you consider risky behaviors. Another one is just driving while distracted. So being distracted when we're driving, as we know, can certainly be problematic and cause issues in terms of, getting into a car accident or getting a ticket or something like that. Risky behaviors are not necessarily problem behaviors, and they're also not developmental psychopathology, which include clinical diagnoses. So risk factors are any factor, any characteristic, any feature of the adolescent's environment that increases the likelihood of engaging in a risky behavior or experiencing a loss due to that behavior. So I'll give you an example. One is that you have low IQ, so having a low intelligence quotient increase your risk of low achievement and its school dropout. But low IQ can also make unemployment more likely for those who drop out. So you see that, having a low IQ increases your risk for low achievement, but then that risk is even furthermore compounded by making employment less likely for those who do drop out and have low IQ. So you can see risk factors kind of accumulate over time as well. Protective factors, on the other hand, are factors that decrease the likelihood of engaging in a risky behavior or experiencing a loss from that behavior. And again, we'll talk you through some examples. So high popularity, for example, can decrease your risk of engaging in minor criminal acts. It might not be necessarily intuitive, but being more popular in school is associated with fewer criminal acts. High popularity also can lead to lighter punishment for those individuals who might commit those acts. So being more well-liked, being more known and popular within a community. Like risk factors, protective factors can also accumulate. We've been talking a lot about various features of adolescent development in this course. with the actual ultimate goal of why a lot of researchers and why a lot of practitioners work with adolescents to do research in this area is to improve optimal adjustment, improve outcomes for all individuals. In addition to promote strong families and promoting healthy relationships among family members, and to help individuals avoid or recover from risk, like we've been talking about, and to avoid psychopathology. So, the question that we're going to get at in this particular class is, how do we do that? One of the main ways is through what's called intervention programs. These are programs or treatments for a problem that may already be in existence. So, in an intervention, you're going to fix the assumed or known cause of the problem in order to bring the body or the mind back into health. So, some really straightforward examples include things like medication. If you have an infection, for example, you're going to take an antibiotic to help fix that problem. Things like counseling or mediation are also known interventions. If you go to counseling, it can help, for example, reduce symptoms of depression. There are also like behavioral plans like IEPs through schools to help individuals get what they need out of their schooling experience. Education curricula as well can also be interventions. Prevention, on the other hand, is a treatment designed to keep problems from starting in the first place or to minimize the potential harmful consequences of risky behaviors. So instead of an intervention where you have a new problem, in prevention, you actually are trying to stop that problem from even occurring. So you're trying to reduce or eliminate those risk factors that we had talked about. So some examples, and we'll be going through some of these in more depth later on in this class, is a really straightforward one is exercise, right? We exercise to prevent long-term health problems, to make sure that our heart is healthy, to reduce things like, to improve our, decrease levels of fat in our body, things like that. Bullying programs as well. In a lot of middle schools, there are programs designed to promote healthy relationships and reduce bullying in school. The DARE program, although we'll talk about some problems with it, the ultimate goal was to reduce the likelihood of doing drugs among middle school and high school youth. A Head Start program is a program for 3 and 4-year-olds to have high quality early childhood programs. And then needle exchanges. Needle exchanges are another prevention. You want to prevent the spread of communicable diseases. So by having needle exchanges for individuals who use intravenous drugs, it then reduces the likelihood of individuals contracting those diseases and sharing it with one another. So in terms of promotion, then, it's kind of a form of prevention. Promotion is a treatment designed to encourage healthy development and discourage unhealthy development. So we can encourage or increase our protective factors. So promotion is kind of the flip side of the prevention programs that we were just talking about. Promotion then encourages or increases those protective factors instead of decreasing those risky ones. So by promoting healthy practices, the problems then are prevented. So, perhaps by taking vitamins, we can stay healthy. Other examples are things like positive youth development programs. So these programs, instead of trying to get rid of any risky behavior, they do things like promoting civic engagement, promoting feelings of self-efficacy. Youth centers as well. The idea is you get youth together and encourage healthy behaviors and encourage healthy relationships. Throughout this class, we're going to talk a lot about the context of interventions in adolescence, and this is what you'll be thinking about for your paper for this course as well. Where do adolescents live, and how does the context matter for the effectiveness or the delivery of an intervention? So, so first we have the individual level, right? So the individual means individual level, both in that we all have individual characteristics that can influence our receptivity to different interventions, but we also can receive individual level treatment, right, or interventions. So we could work with a doctor, a therapist, a teacher, or a coach. At family level, you could have parent training. You could have, often when children are young, you're going to have therapy with a counselor and a child and a parent, for example. You could also have peer level, where you have interventions that occur among groups. Girls on the Run is one such intervention where you have, it's actually more of a prevention program where you have groups of elementary school girls together with a mentor and coach to exercise, to run, and to train for a 5K, but also to promote healthy relationships among those girls. In addition, we have classroom or school level, and this one is probably intuitive because a lot of us probably may have experienced these in high school, where you may have a teacher or a school counselor work with a group of youth. For example, when I was in middle school, I was with my school counselor, got a group of girls together whose parents were divorced. And so we had an opportunity to share our experiences and talk about our feelings. You could also have community level. So perhaps a community-wide effort to promote a behavior or prevent one with some sort of external expert. And then you also might have universal interventions where you have media campaigns or different social policies. So, for example, there might be different media campaigns to promote healthy body image around for teen girls. Knowing that body image can also be an issue among adolescent girls. So you could have a social media campaign, for example, talking about the different diversity of body types. And the important thing to note is that you really want to think about the level or context that fits the presumed cause. So, in the last example, when we talked about the social media campaign, a lot of what we think about why adolescents struggle with body image issues is because of a lot of um, the images that they see about women in pop culture, right? All these movie stars that have perfect bodies and the rock stars that are flawless. And so knowing that they're consuming that in their media, you might have a media campaign to promote body image, right? Because we think that context is also the cause of that problem. And it's important to, as I mentioned, all these, you're going to want to target the presumed cause of the problem or issue, right? So if, as we said, if you think that the issue is at the media level, you're going to want to have a social media campaign to target it. If you instead are worried about bullying in the school, you're really going to want to focus on the school context, right? Because you think that is the cause of the problem or the issue. A social media campaign might just be too broad and won't affect that particular issue. And then depending on the level you're talking about, you're going to take different approaches in terms of the timing, in terms of the age of the youth or the time of year, and also how direct you are at confronting it. It's also important to keep in mind that when we're talking about these programs, we're really interested in how effective these interventions are. So efficacy doesn't mean, of course, that the problem is entirely solved or eliminated. We are humans, and it's really unrealistic to think that any program or intervention could be just a panacea or to solve a particular issue. However, we do want to make sure that the programs that we're using are evidence-based and have real data that we can point to, improving different behaviors or reducing different risk factors. Obviously, programs and interventions can be costly and complex to implement and evaluate, which makes it all the more important that we make sure we have evidence to support the use of a particular intervention. As I alluded to, you also want to make sure that you tailor interventions for the particular developmental level and context, right? So you're not going to have a body image program for toddlers, right? That's nothing that concerns them, right? there's no one-size-fits-all approach, and we'll talk a little bit more about this across this lecture. Um, Prevention and early intervention tend to be more effective than treatments or later interventions, and they also tend to be more cost effective, right? So it is better if you can prevent drug use among adolescents, right, than to have to go through a treatment program to once the adolescents get older or become addicted, right? Those are much more um, cost effective. You can prevent the initiation of those behaviors overall. And there are different approaches needed for different issues. So what works for some situations and some people aren't necessarily going to work across the board, even for the same outcome. It really has to do with the duration of the problems and the different risk factors. And we'll talk through some examples across this lecture. Um, if a program is not evidence-based, you could actually do some real harm. In addition to the fact that you're actually wasting time and money and effort, right? As we know, schools in particular, but social service agencies, government there's not uh, we struggle with resources, right? So you want to make sure that what you're implementing is going to be the best and is going to work. So as an example, and I'll walk you through a few more details in the next slide. DARE, the Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program, is a program where cops and teachers tell youth about how dangerous drugs are, they should prevent drug use and abuse, and even show different types of drugs. But it's been found that DARE actually doesn't work. So, unfortunately, um, the Department of Justice report in 1994 pointed out there was no convincing evidence that DARE worked. This was followed up by a 10-year follow-up of this program, published in 1999, again suggesting that 10 years post-DARE, there were no positive effects. In addition, West and Neal in 2004 found that there were extremely small or non-significant effects from meta-analyses of 40 studies. Meta-analyses are kind of accumulations or averages of different effects across different studies. So across 40 studies, they really found that there were no significant effects or very small ones. In 2009, the Department of Justice did a follow-up and also found there were no long-term improvements in substance use or abuse outcomes from this program. So, why would we waste money, effort, get children in classrooms if it's not going to work? DARE has been, and the use. So, if we think about when we're targeting interventions, that a school-based program with cops and teachers, that might not be the appropriate context for intervening. It might be not the appropriate age, right? And especially since we know using drugs is far more complex than just trying to encourage youth not, to learn why they're bad, right? DARE has been revised and rebranded, called Keeping It Real. And these are more focused around decision making and having short presentations. Another example are abstinence-only sexual education programs. So in these programs, it's really just focused on abstaining, right? You don't have sex until you're married or until you have a long-term partner. And that you should just have these strong morals to be able to successfully abstain. But the cause of youth sex risk isn't due to moral failing. Sex is a natural human behavior, and it's normative to have sex in adolescence. The average age is in the teenage years of initial sexual initiation. And so, evidence-based sex ed program would instead, address the issues for engaging in early sex, in particular for engaging in unprotected sex, which can have real negative consequences. It's important to point out that there is, of course, real value of prevention and intervention programs. So, and there's a few other details important to keep in mind. Behavior problems are often the best predictor, or I'm sorry, prior behaviors rather, are the best predictor of future behaviors. So if we know that a precursor to a particular risk behavior, if we know when that behavior occurs, and if we can intervene earlier before the problem occurs, it's more likely that you can intervene early and prevent that behavior. If you have, for example, adolescents engaging in, for example, petty theft, right, in middle school. If you know that problem is occurring, if you prevent it earlier, and if you stop it when it's a more perhaps minor behavior, it's not going to escalate into other more severe behaviors with age. This is likely due to the accumulation of risk and protective factors across development. So, research shows us that more risk factors tend to go with fewer protective factors, which in turn lead to more risk behaviors and then fewer positive behaviors. So, it's kind of a cyclical process, right? If you have risk behaviors and fewer protective, then over time, you're going to likely engage in more risky behaviors. Um, Also, and again, we're going to stress this a lot in this lecture, that we have these nested ecological contexts, meaning that we live in a diversity of settings from our school to our neighborhood to our home. And we also find that more impoverished settings put us particularly at higher risk for um, having more risk behaviors among children and adolescents. I'm going to walk us through an example here that we'll return to later in class. So this is from Rich Lerner's developmental contextual model of adolescence. And what we see here is that we have the child, and the child obviously has a diversity of characteristics, including biological, cognitive, personality, temperament, behavior. The child, though, doesn't live, in a little bubble, right? The child has a parent. The parent also has particular cognitive, biological, personality, and temperamental characteristics. And these two can influence one another, right? If you have a child who um, has a more difficult temperament or personality, that can then relate to potentially different feelings of frustration or emotion on the part of the parent, right? And that can make the parent in turn interact differently toward the child. In addition, children then, especially adolescents, are in schools, they have peers. The parent is going to, have some particular relationship, even if he or she is not married. And so that can affect the parent and the child as well. The parent then is going to go to work, right? The different stressors at a job or the different perhaps compensation or praise can affect the parent, which could then in turn affect the child, right? At a more broader level, we have children and parents and families that live in different neighborhoods and communities within a broader society and then a different culture, right? So all these different levels can affect the interaction of the parent and child and other different social characteristics as well, like schools and marriages. Obviously, then we have the child getting older, the parent getting older. This passage of time is a really critical factor when we think about development and context. And as I said, we're going to return to this a little later in this lecture, but it's just important to remember that when we're thinking about where we're intervening, where we're providing a particular intervention, we have to think about all these diversity of networks of social characteristics, of context that children are living in. So I'll give an example of an intervention. It's called the family checkup. The family checkup is a preventative intervention for toddlers in high-risk families. So high risk could mean that they have a single parent, could mean they live in a low-income community, could mean that the family is on some sort of social welfare program. So the ultimate goal is to prevent problem behaviors in adolescence. But as I said, risk factors can accumulate over time and contribute to risky behaviors. So if we intervene early in toddlerhood, we might be able to prevent some of those behaviors. In the family checkup program, the initial evaluation is at age 2, where you have checkups at least once per year in key developmental transitions. And you identify children in particular with negative emotionality, with certain behavior problems. They might act out, maybe they bite, maybe they hit, they have huge temper tantrums. If we also identify families with some risk factors, including parental depression, low marital quality, low problematic parent-child interactions, and identify communities with neighborhood risk, for example, with high levels of crime or that are particularly impoverished. We identify children and families and communities with these challenges, then deliver this family checkup problem and might reduce those problems in adolescence. So the results of this program do suggest um, um, that um, I'm sorry, the assessments then are shared with families. You have family management trainings that are focused on limit setting, on proactive parenting, on positive reinforcement, and relationship building. Again, with the goal of reducing those risk factors and promoting behaviors over time. Now, you might be asking, how are we going to effectively intervene within a developmental context? Now, this is broadly what you do, and I'm going to walk through each one of these examples in different slides. But as a first step, you really need to identify the problems that you want to prevent. You have to do a needs assessment. Um, decisions about doing an intervention are really complex. So we have to make sure we have stakeholders at the table to identify these problems. Um, yes, so then we have to decide how we define effective. What is going to be an effective intervention for this problem, for this context? So you're going to identify intervention targets. What are the behaviors we want to change? What programs out there exist that can target those behaviors? We're then going to select a specific program or strategy with evidence that can help with this problem. And importantly, you want to tailor it for adolescents in the social and cultural context. You always have to keep in mind, like we looked at that, rich learners, the big figure I just showed you a few slides ago, that you have to tailor it to the needs of the cultural context. And then we can encourage participant buy-in, right? You want to make sure that participants are engaged and want to participate in the program, and then evaluate the efficacy of the program. So we're going to walk through some examples here. So before an intervention begins, it's crucial to do a formal needs assessment, and this is done in order to confirm that the problem exists, to what degree, and who experiences that problem. If the needs assessment shows that there isn't a problem, there's obviously no point in intervening, right? If teen birth rates are low, there's probably no point in having a program to prevent teenage pregnancy, right? But if the needs assessment shows that there's a problem, it's important to explore whether it's experienced by many different types of youth or just some subgroups, so we can make informed decisions about where to intervene. So this can be done in various ways. For example, you can use the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System, or the YRBSS, which is a needs assessment at the national, state, and in some cases city level, done by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to improve well-being in the U.S. And the data are used to inform an intervention-related decision-making at the federal, state, and sometimes local levels. But it's not the only way the needs assessment can be done. You can obviously also involve other stakeholders in a needs assessment. It answers the question. The questions: is there a problem? How common is the problem? And who experiences the problem? So the stakeholders can decide to address it and what the cost benefit is. For example, say you choose a problem that exists in the school, or you do a needs assessment as a school. That can be done by school staff with the goal of doing a school-based intervention. Obviously, then if it's a state, then politicians will be involved. So you have to think about the level that you're conducting the needs assessment at. Once it's been established there's a need and who has the need, then the stakeholders can decide what to do about it. For example, decisions about sexual risk-taking interventions are often at governmental levels. State or federal governments may mandate schools or communities to do interventions and may provide funding in particular areas to do those programs. They can also attach different strings. For example, during the Obama administration, the federal government would fund comprehensive sexuality education programs, commonly referred to as abstinence plus programs, that are designed to promote abstinence, but also to teach youth about safe sex and strong relationships. So stakeholders have to make decisions about whether or not the cost-benefit ratio is then favorable. Specifically, at the governmental level, the decisions often made in terms of comparing how much it would cost to intervene or prevent problem behaviors versus how much it would cost to treat those, right? Like we talked a little bit about. Prevention through sexuality education is by far cheaper than the accumulated cost of treating sexually transmitted diseases or obviously the cost of teen pregnancy. So when the costs of intervention are less than those associated with the problem it's designed to treat, then it has a favorable cost-benefit ratio. Um, so then we identify intervention targets and outcome benchmarks. So um, the definition of effective, we have to define what effective means for that issue. Once a needs assessment of some sort has been done, the target needs to be identified. Those stakeholders need to decide what specific problems they're trying to solve and what benchmarks will be the threshold for determining whether the intervention is effective. These are called intervention targets. Remember, effective does not mean the issue is totally solved because it's generally unrealistic. Effective usually means that the problem is reduced or health is improved depending on what the goal is. Scholars determine if an intervention is effective by measuring whether those intervention targets have been met after the intervention has been occurred. This can be done through evaluation studies. Often these evaluation studies are longitudinal and will be both short and long-term intervention targets. For example, in sex risk intervention studies involving education, short-term targets might include improvements in knowledge of safer sex practices and greater mastery of strategies for effective sexual communication immediately after the intervention and perhaps a few months later. Longer-term targets then might include things like behavioral outcomes, increases in condom use at 6 and 12 months after the intervention or even longer, or reduced rates of sexual debut in that population with some age set as that particular benchmark. So say, for example, by age 16. Then stakeholders should choose how to intervene. So you target by age is crucial because what works for young teens may be very inappropriate for older teens. The best course of action is to select an evidence-based program that's already in existence and is known to work for that age group. Evaluation studies get published just like any other studies, so you'll find these data just like you can in any other article. But scholars in academic and applied settings also often develop new programs or approaches based on theories or empirical evidence of how that problem develops. Either way, the program should intervene in the factors and theory that evidence say are what's crucial in causing the problem at that point in development. The content should reflect this accordingly. For example, for most populations, it would be inappropriate to target strategies for negotiating condom use with 12-year-olds, but this would be much more appropriate for 15-year-olds. For 11 and 12-year-olds, we'd be better served by making sure that they understand the facts of life and by arming them with strategies for problem-solving decision-making and considering future consequences of their actions. The program also needs to be developmentally appropriate in terms of how it approaches the content. These are referred to as styles of delivery. In essence, that is how the intervention is delivered to the participants. So, for teen sexuality programs, this can be canned curricula with scripts for teachers to follow and pre-designed learning activities and materials such as videos, recordings, and whatnot. Again, these need to be developmentally appropriate. Those 11 and 12-year-olds are probably going to respond better to materials geared to their maturity and reading level. For example, books written at this age group are often resemble comic books, and the authors try to be funny in order to help young adolescents feel comfortable discussing what we know can be an uncomfortable topic. This won't be necessary for older teens who can most likely handle more serious material that include more technical details, scientific terminology, and explanations, and so forth. So then we're going to tailor the programs or strategies for the social or cultural context. Often decisions about age appropriateness are made in conjunction with decisions about how to tailor a program to populations in this intervention. There's consensus in the literature that tailored interventions are more effective than one-size-fits-all approach in preventing youth risk behaviors. Intervention content, design, and delivery can and should be tailored to different populations by addressing specific risk behaviors or risk patterns. We know that some populations have sex earlier rather than later for a variety of reasons. We also know that these different populations have unique risk factors. And what predicts risk in African American boys is not going to be the same as in Hispanic girls, for example. So we have to be sensitive to gender, race, ethnicity, and setting. What works for some youth won't work for all youth, as there can be different causes and developmental pathways for different populations. So sexuality education curricula tailored to youth sex, ethnicity, culture, and degree of sexual experience is going to be critical. So trying a one-size-fits-all approach won't work, um, and won't work well at all because the factors that cause the risk behaviors might not be addressed appropriately. And now I'm going to talk through some more specific examples with the Bickle and McDonough article in relation to preventing youth risk behavior in West Virginia. So in their article, they talk about how there's a perception that West Virginia difficulties are due to a self-perpetuating rural Appalachian culture that is ill-suited to productive, healthful living in a model world. These are some quotes from the article that you can take a look at. But the authors call a lot of what they talk about victim blaming, where you blame the victim for their particular problems and plights. But instead, what they say is where the state of West Virginia has failed is in terms of planning its interventions is a lack of thought in terms of intervening in the appropriate cultural context and not considering the social environment. So we're going to return to the figure we looked at earlier. So the primary solutions that have often been targeted in West Virginia have been to encourage education, and targets include individual adolescents, families, and schools, as illustrated in the figure. The problem with this approach is that it ignores the degree to which these factors are intertwined within each other and across systems. For example, there are shared genetics across generations, and gene-environment interactions may be important. The bigger problem is that it ignores the larger context within which the individual teens, families, and schools are embedded. So as I said, risk factors accumulate, right? And poor families are going to be disproportionately clustered into specific schools and neighborhoods due to home costs, for example. So efforts, again, have traditionally focused on these specific aspects here, the child, the parent, and the school, often ignoring the broader context. So here's some examples of accumulating risk factors in the context of West Virginia. We have, for example, struggling communities. We know there's crumbling infrastructure. There was recently a road bond passed to try to fix that because it's a known fact that a lot of our roads are full of potholes. I know I have been driving often in the middle of the road on the mile ground to avoid some giant potholes I fear will swallow my tire and car. We also know that there's a huge opioid epidemic within the community that's going to have trickle-down effects. And that accessing healthcare can be a problem in some particularly rural and isolated areas of the state. In some of our counties, for example, there is no OBGYN for pregnant moms. We know that there's also been school consolidation. So what used to be more neighborhood schools are now bigger, broader community schools that often have fewer of those community connections. If we go and think about the schools, then we also know that there can be limited childcare or preschool access in some communities. I recently did some work mapping where our childcare centers across the state are located. And in some areas, in some counties of our state, there's no center-based childcare, for example. So there's limited access to high quality preschool. We also know, given the recent strike and teacher walkout, that there are underfunded schools, that there are teacher shortages. Teachers have some of the lowest compensation in the state, and so there are in turn teacher shortages. We also know that there's higher levels of dropout in the state. If we think then about the child, at the child level, there can often be problems with malnutrition. Food insecurity is a real problem in our state. Children accessing high quality and nutritious school can be a problem, particularly when they're not in school. There are also issues because of a lot of these broader community issues that I talked about in terms of stress, psychopathology, and also with drug use and hopelessness. There's been a lot of research suggesting that hopelessness really relates to a lot of problematic behaviors on parts of, in terms of adults, and then with trickle-down effects for the child. So there are problems also across the state in terms of unemployment and underemployment, where parents often struggle to earn a good living um, because of their the cultural context, because there might just not be a lot of employers. Because, for example, of the closing coal mines, we know that in some counties there's not enough employment opportunities left for families. That can then lead to outmigration or breaking up of families. If there are no jobs, families are going to have to leave, but it might mean leaving different relatives behind, which could break down then the broader social networks. More broadly, we know that there can be disrespect from outsiders in West Virginia. There can be harmful stereotypes in terms of what it means to live and be a West Virginian. So, given all of that, so I should just say, since we know that there are a lot of these broader social and cultural contexts, you need to make sure that interventions then need to be tailored in these contexts. So if you think about those outer layers as legs on the stool and the individual and familial level stuff is the top of the stool, if you have an impoverished community, it's like kicking a leg out of a stool. You can try to use the top of it, but it's not going to do much to help you reach what you want within the cupboard. In addition, you have to tailor for West Virginia adolescents in terms of encouraging participant buy-in. So as informed by Bickle and McDonough, efforts need to in consider teens' anticipated economic outcomes and their psychological costs. So they argue that adolescent risk behaviors are due to the degree to which teens anticipate economic opportunities and the very real social and psychological costs they experience in their lives. So tailoring needs to reflect the actual experiences of young people in the communities and their daily realities is critical. They found in their analysis that high school dropout was reduced in communities with high economic opportunities, high incomes, and accessible jobs, for example. Teens have incentives to stay in school if there's a point to it, right? If there are good jobs to be had for those who have a high school diploma. But what if there aren't? So staying in school and getting a good job is part of being a member of a community. And if a teen identifies positively in that community, then they should stay in school as long as there aren't too many personal costs associated with staying in school. So they name being on a low skill track and being devalued racial group or going into a large school that likely provided limited opportunities for good teacher-student interactions as being a problem. Having a sense of community and being with peers and having teachers and others in the school setting is linked to reduced dropout. And dropout and pregnancy, importantly, are often intertwined. Those who become pregnant are more likely to drop out. But we know from other research that teens who become pregnant and drop out um, are in this trajectory long before the events occur. And there needs to be a point to a teen to avoiding pregnancy, right? Economic opportunity is our major incentive also to avoiding pregnancy. Although some argue that welfare is an economic incentive that encourages teen pregnancy, the research actually doesn't bear this out. Welfare supports are too small or too meager to provide a real incentive, and as children cost far more than what welfare provides. So when they looked out of the school and community factors that predict teen pregnancy, they found that rates were lower in communities that had greater economic advantages. If schools were smaller in size, through encouraging a sense of community, and what they called low departures from traditional community patterns. I think a better way to think about this is as collective community risk. In those weaker communities, risks for teen pregnancy were higher. Finally, they considered violent deaths in adolescence. They used a combined variable reflecting suicides and homicides. And again, they found that the likelihood of violent death was lower in communities with economic opportunities, indexed by high average wages and low employment rates. They also found that the higher the cumulative community risk, the higher the likelihood of violent death. There wasn't an impact of school community, but these other effects of community and economic factors held even with individual characteristics like the adolescent's own household income were controlled. So, if we think about it in terms of this broader context, this means that it's not just individual factors by themselves, like individual SES, it's also in the community in which the family lives. So instead of targeting parental control, personality traits, or even failures of morality, they identify economic and social targets related to the broader community. So, by their logic, intervening to improve economic prospects of communities will help improve community and social cohesion, with then collateral effects help like hopelessness improving and decreased risk taking. So that's kind of the logic you can think about within the broader context is related to that article. Okay, so let's go back and think about this model for intervention effectiveness. We also have to make sure that we are encouraging participant buy-in. So you have to make sure you, for example, advertise for a particular intervention. You might also make incentives. Now, incentives don't have to mean money. It can just mean like food. Food often serves as a great incentive. Things like pizza or snacks, things like that, for participating in a program. And as we talked a lot about, tailored interventions often just generically work better and will in turn promote more buy-in. Support for community informants and facilitators is also very, very important. So you have to make sure that whoever is actually implementing the program has appropriate supports to make the program effective. And then lastly, we also want to make sure we are evaluating the program. So even when we are tailoring a program, we still have to make sure it works. Does it work? Is it effective? Is it more effective than the control conditions? So is it effective than not having a particular program or in a particular alternative to that program? And remember, we're going to look at both short and long-term targets. So um, what are those perceptual factors maybe that are changing? What are the beliefs that are changing? And then in the long term, our actual behaviors, like are we seeing adolescents using more condoms, for example, or do teen birth rates drop? And there are different experimental or quasi-experimental designs that can help us evaluate those programs. So that's the end of this intervention slideshow. I hope you found it helpful in understanding more how prevention and intervention programs work, and in particular in helping you think about your paper for this class.